Working as a waitress on a cruise ship, the woman was paralyzed when she saw that the millionaire was her husband, who had died 7 years ago. She approached him, and the unexpected happened. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Elizabeth Garcia felt as though she was living in a constant shadow. It had been another exhausting day at the restaurant where she worked as a waitress. Her hands trembled as she cleared the plates from a table, not only from accumulated fatigue, but also from the suffocating debt that had weighed on her for 7 long years, ever since she had lost her husband, James. The creditors showed no mercy, and every phone call or knock on the door filled her with fear for her children, Thomas and Sophia. Elizabeth, you need to hurry with those tables. We've got tourists waiting, barked her boss in a sharp tone as he walked past her. I'm almost done. Just give me 2 minutes, she replied with a controlled voice, though the pressure was crushing her. She couldn't afford to lose this job. The day had barely begun, but there was already a heavy weight in her chest that made it hard to breathe. As she rushed between tables, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She quickly excused herself from a customer and pulled it out, hoping it wasn't another threat. It was her friend Emma. Elizabeth, we need to talk. It's important, said Emma's concerned voice on the other end of the line. Emma, I'm in the middle of work. Can we talk later? She replied, trying not to sound impatient. It's about a job. It's on a luxury cruise ship. Elizabeth, I heard they pay enough to get you out of this mess. I know you need the money. Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment, wishing for something, anything. That could be the solution. We'll talk later, Emma. I need to think. She ended the call just as a couple at another table was calling her over. Sorry for the delay. May I take your order? She asked, forcing a smile even though her face showed her exhaustion. At around 4 in the afternoon, her entire world seemed to freeze. Elizabeth was cleaning a table near the restaurant entrance when the heavy sound of footsteps made her turn around. 2 tall, broad-shouldered men with harsh faces walked straight toward her. Elizabeth Garcia, one of them said, fixing her with a stare that made her heart race. Yes, I'm working right now. Could you wait outside? She replied, trying to sound firm, but her voice cracked. We're not waiting, the man said coldly, dropping a yellow envelope onto the table in front of her. This is a reminder that you owe money. We want it soon. No more excuses. Elizabeth tried to maintain her composure. I've told you, I'm paying what I can. I have 2 small children. I can't give more right now. The man smirked coldly. Then make your kids a priority, because if you don't pay up, they'll be the ones who suffer. The air seemed to leave the restaurant. Please, don't threaten my children. I just need more time. I'm working extra hours, doing everything I can. Time is something you don't have, the second man said. We'll see you soon, and you'd better have more than excuses next time. Elizabeth watched as the men left, her legs trembling so much she could barely stand. Her co-workers glanced at her, but none dared to approach. Shame and fear left her paralyzed. That evening, in her small apartment, Elizabeth prepared dinner for Thomas and Sophia while trying to hide her anguish. The children, oblivious to her struggles, played on the floor with colorful blocks. Mom, can you come play with us? Sophia asked, her smile lighting up the room. In a little bit, sweetheart. I just need to finish here, Elizabeth replied, forcing herself to sound cheerful. But as she stared at the boiling pot on the stove, her mind drifted to the yellow envelope sitting on the table. The threats were real, and no matter how hard she worked, it would never be enough to escape her debt. Emma had been right. Maybe the cruise job was her only option. Later that night, after putting the kids to bed, Elizabeth sat at the table with her phone in hand. Her heart pounded as she dialed Emma's number. Emma, I'll take the job. I don't know how I'll leave the kids, but I don't have any other choice. They'll be safe with me, Elizabeth. Don't worry about them. Just make sure this opportunity helps you move forward, Emma replied with a reassuring firmness. The next morning, Elizabeth said goodbye to Thomas and Sophia with tears in her eyes. I'm going to work far away, but I promise I'll be back soon. Be good for Aunt Emma, okay? Will you bring us presents, Mom? Thomas asked, hugging her tightly. Of course, my love. I love you both so much, she replied, kissing their foreheads. She boarded the bus to the port, her eyes fixed on the horizon. When she arrived, the cruise ship was imposing, a floating palace that seemed like another world. The lights gleamed, and the sound of music filled the air as wealthy passengers boarded in elegance. Wearing her waitress uniform, Elizabeth stepped onto the ship, feeling completely out of place. As she walked down the hallways adorned with marble and chandeliers, a heaviness settled in her chest. It wasn't just the distance from her children, it was a dark premonition, a sense that something awaited her. Hours later, while unpacking in her tiny cabin, her phone buzzed. Hoping it was Emma, she answered, but a strange male voice came through the line. "We know where you are. Don't think you can escape?" The phone slipped from her hands. Through the small cabin window, Elizabeth watched as the cruise ship drifted away from the port, carrying her toward an uncertain destiny. Elizabeth, wearing the snug uniform of a waitress, walked through the gleaming corridors, feeling like she was in a world designed to crush those who didn't belong. Marble floors, glistening chandeliers, and walls adorned with expensive artwork surrounded her. Each step made her feel smaller, more insignificant. The main restaurant was in chaos as preparations for the grand gala dinner were underway. Elizabeth followed instructions to the letter, placing glasses and cutlery with precision while supervisors patrolled with critical eyes. "Elizabeth, those napkins need to be perfectly folded. We don't tolerate mistakes here," one of them remarked, pointing out a detail on the table. "I'll fix it right away," she replied calmly, though the stress was burning her from the inside out. As she adjusted the silverware, she couldn't help but overhear conversations among her coworkers. There was a palpable nervousness in the air. "They say someone important is coming tonight," one of her colleagues mentioned while arranging flowers on a nearby table. "A famous millionaire. He always hosts dinners like this for his associates. Make sure you don't make any mistakes if you're near his table," another added with a warning tone. At first, Elizabeth paid little attention. Her mind was occupied with thoughts of Thomas and Sophia. She wanted to call them, to hear their voices, but she knew she'd have to wait until her shift was over. As the guests began arriving, the restaurant filled with animated conversations, laughter, and soft music. Elizabeth moved quickly between tables, serving glasses of wine and ensuring everything was perfect. Then, something stopped her in her tracks. A laugh. Elizabeth turned instinctively toward the source of the sound. It was a laugh she knew, one she had heard thousands of times before her life fell apart. Her eyes searched the crowd until she finally saw him. James. He was seated at the end of a long table, surrounded by men and women dressed in elegant attire. His hair was shorter, his beard perfectly trimmed, and he wore a suit that seemed tailored to perfection. He smiled as he spoke confidently, raising a champagne glass. Elizabeth's world froze. Her heart began pounding, and she felt the air leave her lungs. She clutched the tray in her hands, trying to convince herself it was a mistake. "It can't be him," she murmured to herself, her hands trembling. "Elizabeth, are you okay?" a coworker asked, noticing her frozen in the middle of the dining room. "Yes, I'm fine," she replied quickly, trying to regain her composure. But she wasn't fine. She couldn't take her eyes off him. Every gesture, every movement confirmed what her mind refused to accept. It was James, her James, the man she had mourned for 7 years, the man who had left a void in her life that nothing could fill. Elizabeth tried to keep working, but every time she passed near his table, her legs felt weak. Finally, the supervisor called her over to serve drinks at the main table. Her heart sank. She knew she would have to get close to him. As she walked toward the table, each step felt like an eternity. When she finally reached it, she lifted the tray with trembling hands. James was speaking to an elegant woman seated beside him, but the moment Elizabeth leaned in to serve his glass, their eyes met. For a brief second, their gazes locked, and Elizabeth saw something in his expression, a spark of recognition. But then, he looked away indifferently, as if he didn't know her. The tray tilted in her hands, and a glass fell to the floor, shattering into pieces. The entire restaurant went silent as everyone turned their heads toward her. "Careful! What are you doing?" the supervisor exclaimed, rushing toward her. "I'm sorry. It was an accident," Elizabeth said in a trembling voice, quickly crouching to pick up the shards of glass. As she gathered the broken pieces, she felt James's eyes on her. She couldn't understand it. Why hadn't he recognized her? Why was he there, alive, and acting as if nothing had happened? That night, after finishing her shift, Elizabeth locked herself in her small cabin. Her mind was flooded with questions she couldn't answer. She pulled a photo out of her bag, an old picture from her wedding with James. It was impossible for it to be anyone else. It was him. "Why are you here? Why didn't you recognize me?" she murmured, clutching the photo tightly as tears streamed down her face. In that moment, an idea began to form in her mind. She had to confront him. She couldn't continue living with these unanswered questions. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. The fresh ocean breeze enveloped the cruise ship's deck as the gala lights continued to shimmer in the main hall. Elizabeth stood there, away from the noise, searching for answers. Her footsteps echoed against the wooden floor, while her mind replayed the same thought over and over. It's him. There's no doubt. Standing by the railing, she gazed at the waves, her eyes brimming with tears as she struggled to summon the courage to confront him. She couldn't let this opportunity slip away, not after everything she had endured. Taking a deep breath, she turned and made her way to the ship's VIP area, where she had seen him retreat after the dinner. She walked with a steady stride, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She found James on a private terrace, a glass in his hand as he stared out at the horizon, seemingly lost in thought. For a moment, Elizabeth hesitated, but then she remembered the nights of hunger, her children's tears, and the loneliness she had endured for all those years. "Why?" Her voice broke the silence, trembling yet resolute. James turned slowly toward her. At first, his expression was cold, almost distant, but then a shadow of recognition flickered in his eyes. "Elizabeth," he whispered, as if the name burned on his tongue. "It's you, isn't it? I don't understand what's happening." "They told me you were dead," Elizabeth said. Her fists clenched tightly to keep her emotions at bay. James set his glass down on a nearby table and sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You shouldn't be here, Elizabeth. This isn't what you think," he replied evasively, only fueling Elizabeth's anger. "Don't give me excuses. For 7 years, I've lived in hell, raising our children alone, working myself to the bone to pay off the debts you left behind. And now I find you here, enjoying luxury as if nothing ever happened." Her words were a mix of pain and fury, each one carrying the weight of the years she had suffered. James averted his gaze. "You can't understand what really happened. It was more complicated than you think," he said at last, though his voice lacked the confidence it once held. "Then explain it to me. Tell me why you left, why you faked your death." "You owe me that much," Elizabeth demanded, stepping closer, tears streaming down her face. Before James could respond, a woman's voice interrupted the moment. "Is everything all right here?" said an elegant woman who appeared from the shadows, holding a glass of wine. It was Victoria, the woman Elizabeth had seen sitting next to James at dinner. "Everything's fine, under control," James said quickly, avoiding Elizabeth's gaze. "Who is she?" Victoria asked, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Elizabeth with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "That's none of your concern, Victoria. Go back to the hall," James said, attempting to sound firm, but the woman didn't budge. "None of my concern? I think I have every right to know who this woman is, barging in and causing trouble," Victoria retorted with a cold smile, crossing her arms. Elizabeth felt her heart shatter even more as she noticed the familiarity between them. "Is this your new life, James? Is this why you abandoned us? To be with her?" she asked, her voice breaking but still full of strength. "Elizabeth, please, don't do this here," James said, looking at her with what seemed to be a mix of guilt and desperation. "I'm not the one doing this, James. You are. You destroyed our family, and now you ask me to stay silent?" Elizabeth replied, stepping back as though she needed space to breathe. Victoria, sensing the intensity of the conversation, rolled her eyes and stepped closer to James, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to put up with this. We can call security," she said dismissively. "Don't you dare," Elizabeth shot back, pointing a finger at her. "I'm not a stranger. I'm his wife. And even if he doesn't acknowledge me publicly, you cannot take my dignity away." James raised a hand, signaling Victoria to leave. She hesitated but eventually walked away, casting Elizabeth one last contemptuous glance. "Is this how you wanted to find me?" James asked after a long silence. "Of course not, James. I wanted to find you alive, but not like this. I wanted to find the man who promised to love me, not the coward who abandoned us," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. James seemed to want to say something more, but instead, he stepped back, as if the words wouldn't come out. "I can't explain everything right now. It's too complicated, and there are things you wouldn't understand," he murmured before turning and walking away, leaving her alone on the terrace. Elizabeth felt her legs tremble as tears streamed uncontrollably down her face. She leaned on the railing, staring out at the ocean, wondering how she would face the days ahead. When she finally returned to her cabin, she found a note slipped under her door. She opened it with trembling hands and read the words written in black ink, "Stay away if you know what's good for you." Elizabeth clenched the paper tightly, feeling fear mix with determination. She didn't know who had left the note, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going to give up. Elizabeth spent a sleepless night, replaying memories of James as if each one were a thorn piercing her chest. She recalled the day of the accident, the moment authorities told her that her husband was dead. Though his body was never recovered, the thought of losing him had consumed her completely. Now, she knew it had all been a lie. That realization not only filled her with rage, but also with questions that demanded answers. As dawn broke, Elizabeth sat at the small table in her cabin, her eyes fixed on the anonymous note she had found the night before. She had read it so many times that the words were etched into her mind. "Stay away if you know what's good for you." But walking away wasn't an option, not after everything she had uncovered. That morning, as she worked in the cruise ship's dining hall, she observed James from a distance. He was seated at one of the VIP tables, surrounded by well-dressed men and speaking with Victoria. There was something about his body language, the way he interacted with his companions, that seemed completely different from the man she had loved. This James was cold, calculated, someone entirely at ease in this world of luxury and ambition. Elizabeth knew she couldn't confront him directly again without evidence. She needed to understand what was happening, and to do that, she had to start investigating. During a brief break, she decided to approach Emma, a fellow waitress who had always been kind to her. "Emma, can I trust you?" Elizabeth asked, her tone serious, as though she was about to share a heavy secret. "Of course, Elizabeth. What's going on? You seem more worried than usual," Emma replied while clearing a tray of empty plates. "There's something I need to know. That VIP table, the one at the back, do you know anything about the people there? Especially the man with the dark hair who's always with that elegant woman," Elizabeth asked, trying to sound casual. Emma raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. "You mean Mr. Velasco? That's the name listed in the ship's records. But beyond that, I don't know much. He's definitely someone important, though. He always holds private meetings in the exclusive areas. Why do you ask?" Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, but decided to share part of the truth. "I think I know him. Or at least, I think he's someone I knew a long time ago. But something's off. I need to learn more about him." Emma leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "Be careful, Elizabeth. If you're talking about who I think you are, he's someone with a lot of power. And it's not always a good idea to get involved with people like that." Despite Emma's warning, Elizabeth knew she couldn't stop now. Later that afternoon, when her shift ended, she decided to explore the ship further, hoping to find something that would bring her closer to the truth. On one of the VIP-level hallways, she found a locked office door marked as private. Elizabeth knew it belonged to James. She glanced around to make sure no one was watching and approached the door. Though she couldn't enter, she could hear voices from inside. "Everything is under control. The shipment will arrive on time," said a voice she recognized as James. "It better. If anything goes wrong, you'll be the first to pay the price," responded a deep, menacing voice. Elizabeth quickly moved away before anyone saw her. Though she didn't fully understand what she had overheard, it was clear that James was involved in something far bigger than she had imagined. That evening, while cleaning the dining hall after dinner service, Elizabeth came across an object that froze her in place, a wristwatch. It was James' watch, the same one he had worn on the day of the supposed accident. Elizabeth held it in her hands, remembering every detail of it because she had gifted it to him for their anniversary. "Where did you find this?" Emma asked, walking up to her. "It was on a table, but this doesn't make sense. This watch was with James the day he died." "It shouldn't be here," Elizabeth replied, her voice breaking. "Elizabeth, I think you need more than answers. You need proof of whatever's going on here. If this is as big as it seems, you can't face it alone," Emma said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Then help me," Elizabeth said, meeting her gaze with determination. From that moment, the two began working together. Emma provided information about James' schedules and movements, while Elizabeth focused on gathering evidence. On one occasion, while going through some belongings James had left in a meeting room, she found something that sent chills down her spine: an old photograph. In the picture, James stood alongside a group of men, all dressed elegantly and smiling at the camera. On the back of the photo, there was an inscription: "Our pact, our loyalty." Elizabeth didn't fully understand what it meant, but she knew it was an important clue. Before she could hide the photo, she heard footsteps approaching quickly. She tucked the image into her pocket and hid behind a piece of furniture. The door burst open, and someone entered the room. Elizabeth held her breath, peering through a crack as one of James' associates searched the room. "There's nothing here. Maybe someone's messing with us," the man said before leaving. Elizabeth waited a few minutes before coming out of her hiding spot, her heart racing. She knew she was treading on thin ice, but she couldn't stop now. Elizabeth couldn't sleep. The photo she had found, the watch, and the voices she'd overheard in the office replayed in her mind like an unsolvable puzzle. Everything pointed to the fact that James had not only faked his death, but was entangled in something far darker than she had ever imagined. How deep did this abyss go? And most importantly, how could he have abandoned his family to become part of it? The following morning, while serving breakfast in the cruise ship's dining hall, Elizabeth noticed Victoria, the elegant woman always by James' side, watching her from a corner of the room. There was something unnerving in her gaze, a mix of curiosity and disdain that made Elizabeth feel small, as if she were being judged and simultaneously challenged. When her shift ended, Emma was waiting for her at the ship's aft deck, a spot where employees often gathered for fresh air, away from the passengers' prying eyes. "Elizabeth, did you find anything else?" Emma asked, lowering her voice and glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Just this," Elizabeth replied, pulling the photograph from her apron pocket. "Look at this. Do you see what it says on the back? Our pact, our loyalty." "I have no idea what it means, but it's proof that James has been lying from the start." Emma studied the photo closely. "This isn't just a lie, Elizabeth. This is dangerous. These people aren't just businessmen. Look at their faces. They're too comfortable with their power, like they know they're untouchable." Elizabeth clenched her fists, her anger and pain threatening to consume her. "I don't care who they are. James left me, Emma. He abandoned me with 2 small children, with debts, with all the weight of his irresponsibility. And now he's living a life of luxury while we barely survive." "I understand your pain," Emma said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "But you need to be smart. If you're going to confront him, you need a plan. You can't just go and accuse him without solid evidence. These people play dirty." Elizabeth nodded, even as her heart burned with fury. She knew Emma was right, but the thought of standing by and doing nothing made her feel powerless. Later that day, while cleaning one of the meeting rooms, Elizabeth found a document left on a table. She picked it up and quickly read through it, realizing it contained details about financial transactions linked to offshore bank accounts. The names on the document were unfamiliar, but one stood out, underlined in bold: Victoria Fernandez. "So, she's involved too," Elizabeth muttered to herself, slipping the document into her apron pocket. That night, as the passengers enjoyed a themed dinner, Elizabeth went to Emma's cabin with the document in hand. "Look at this," she said, showing her the paper. Emma frowned as she read it. "This is enough to raise suspicions, but it's not enough to bring them down. Elizabeth, if we go down this path, there's no turning back. Are you sure you want to do this?" "Emma, I don't have a choice, Elizabeth replied, her voice trembling but resolute. I can't let James get away with what he's done. And if Victoria is part of this, she needs to pay too. I can't stay silent. All right, Emma said after a moment of reflection. Then we'll do this together. But first, we need more evidence. The next day, Emma used her access to the ship's internal system to gather information about the movements of VIP passengers, including James and Victoria. They discovered that the two had booked a private meeting in the ship's largest conference room for that very night. This is our chance, Emma said, showing Elizabeth the schedule. We can spy on that meeting and see what they're planning. But we need to be extremely careful. If they catch us, they won't, Elizabeth said, her eyes blazing with determination. We have to do this. That night, the two women hid behind a heavy curtain in the conference room, where they had a limited but sufficient view of the proceedings. James, Victoria, and two other men were seated around a table, speaking in hushed tones. We can't let this deal go wrong, one of the men said, slamming his fist on the table. We've invested too much to risk it now. It won't go wrong, James replied, his tone calm yet authoritative. The money is secured, and the shipments are on their way. We just need to keep everything under control here. And what about the woman? Victoria asked, fixing her gaze on James. What woman? One of the men interjected. The waitress, Victoria said disdainfully. I've seen the way she looks at him. She's too interested in things that don't concern her. Are you sure she's not a problem, James? Elizabeth held her breath, fear gripping her chest. Don't worry about her, James said with a cold smile. If she becomes a problem, I'll make sure she regrets it. Elizabeth felt as though James' words were a dagger to her heart. Despite everything, part of her had wanted to believe that the man she had loved still existed somewhere inside him. But now she understood that he was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. When the meeting ended, Elizabeth and Emma emerged from their hiding spot, more determined than ever. Now we know they're planning something big, Elizabeth said. And we know they have no scruples. But I'm not stopping. Not after this. Elizabeth knew she had reached a point of no return. Every word she overheard in the clandestine meeting echoed in her mind, filling her with fear, but also unwavering determination. That night, as she tried to sleep in her cabin, her thoughts turned to her children. Everything she did was for them. She knew the risks were high, but she couldn't stand by while James continued to be involved in crimes that could destroy lives, just as he had destroyed hers. The next morning, Elizabeth summoned her courage and decided it was time to confront him. She was well aware that James considered her a threat and that any misstep could put her in danger, but she needed answers. After finding out that James would spend the afternoon on the cruise's private deck, she headed there with steady steps, her heart pounding in her chest. When she found him, he was lounging on a luxurious beach chair, cocktail in hand, with an expression of calm that cruelly contrasted with the chaos he had unleashed in her life. Victoria was by his side, but upon seeing Elizabeth approach, she stood and walked away without a word, leaving them alone. "What are you doing here?" James asked, not bothering to hide his irritation. "I thought we made it clear you have nothing to do with me." "Nothing to do with you?" Elizabeth shot back, her voice laced with anger. "After everything we went through together? After you left me alone, thinking you were dead? And now you say I have nothing to do with you?" James sighed and stood up. "Elizabeth, you don't understand. You have no idea what I had to do to survive. Faking my death wasn't easy, but it was necessary." "For what?" Elizabeth demanded, tears brimming in her eyes. "To betray your family? To live in luxury while your children and I struggled to survive? How could you do this to us, James?" He looked away, as though her words had struck a nerve, but he didn't respond. Elizabeth seized the silence to press further. "And Victoria? What role does she play in all of this? I saw you with her. I heard what you said in that meeting. I know you're involved in something illegal, James. What are you doing?" "That's none of your business," he said finally, his tone sharp. "It's better for you to stay out of this, Elizabeth. I'm not the man you knew. My life is different now, and if you keep trying to uncover the truth, you're only putting yourself in danger." "In danger?" Elizabeth repeated, stepping closer. "Are you threatening me now? After everything you've already taken from me?" Before James could respond, a crew member appeared on the deck, interrupting their conversation. "Mr. James, you're needed in the conference room. It's urgent." He nodded and cast one last look at Elizabeth before walking away. "I'm warning you, Elizabeth. Let this go. You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Elizabeth watched him leave, frustration bubbling inside her. She knew she couldn't stop now. James was hiding something significant, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. That night, Elizabeth and Emma gathered in Emma's cabin to plan their next move. Emma had been secretly gathering information, using her access to the ship system to find more evidence against James and his associates. "This is what I found," Emma said, placing her laptop on the table. On the screen were records of bank transfers linked to offshore accounts. These transactions are under James and Victoria's names. It looks like they're using the cruise as a front to move illegal money. Elizabeth stared at the numbers on the screen, anger swelling inside her. This is enough to implicate them, but we need something undeniable, something that will force them to face justice. Emma nodded. "I've heard rumors that tomorrow they're meeting with one of their most important contacts. It'll be in the cruise's main hall. If we can record what they say, we'll have definitive proof." "It's risky," Elizabeth said, biting her lip, "but we don't have a choice. If we want to stop this, we have to act now." The next morning, Elizabeth and Emma prepared to infiltrate the meeting. Emma secured a small recording device and hid it in Elizabeth's apron, as she would be serving drinks in the main hall during the gathering. When the meeting began, Elizabeth moved cautiously around the hall, making sure not to draw attention as she served drinks. From her position, she could hear snippets of the conversation between James, Victoria, and their associates. "Everything is set for the shipment," one of the men said. "We just need to make sure the crew doesn't suspect anything." "That won't be a problem," Victoria replied confidently. "We have everything under control." Elizabeth's heart raced as she listened. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop now. Suddenly, one of the men pointed in her direction. "What about her? Can she be trusted?" Elizabeth froze, keeping her expression neutral as she pretended to pour a drink. "She doesn't know anything," James said dismissively. "She's just a waitress." The comment stung more than she expected, but she maintained her composure. She couldn't afford to react. When the meeting ended, Elizabeth returned to Emma's cabin, trembling with adrenaline. "I recorded everything," she said, handing over the device. Emma plugged it into her laptop, and they began listening to the recording. Every word confirmed James and his group's illegal activities. "This is enough to expose them," Emma said, a mix of excitement and worry in her voice. "But it also puts us in danger. We need to be careful about what we do next." Elizabeth nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She knew this was just the beginning and that the consequences of their actions could be devastating. The tension aboard the cruise ship grew heavier with each step Elizabeth took. The recording she and Emma had secured was powerful but incredibly dangerous. As the two women listened to fragments of the clandestine meeting again in Emma's cabin, a constant sense of danger hung over them. It was a secret too big to hold, and they knew James and his circle would do whatever it took to protect it. "We need to deliver this as soon as possible," Emma said, her brow furrowed as she reviewed the files on her laptop. "But we can't do it from here. They've got contacts all over the ship. If anyone suspects what we're planning, we won't make it off this boat." Elizabeth nodded, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. "We can't fail now. This is our only chance to stop them." As they spoke, someone knocked on the cabin door. Both women froze, exchanging alarmed glances. "Were you expecting anyone?" Elizabeth whispered. "No," Emma replied, quickly shutting her laptop and hiding the recording device. "Ladies, I'm with housekeeping," a male voice said from the other side. "May I come in to clean the room?" Elizabeth hesitated, but finally replied, "No need. We're busy." There was a strange silence before the sound of retreating footsteps. Yet Elizabeth and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Later, Elizabeth tried to act normal as she worked in the cruise ship's restaurant. Her heart still raced, but she knew she couldn't let anyone suspect her. However, something about the atmosphere felt off. The staff seemed more nervous than usual, and Victoria kept watching her from a distance, her gaze sharp and probing. While picking up an order in the kitchen, one of the waiters approached her. It was Mason, a young man who had always been kind to her. "Elizabeth, be careful," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "Why?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "Victoria's been asking questions about you," Mason said. "She wanted to know how long you've been working here, and if you interact with the VIP guests. I don't know what she's planning, but it seems like she doesn't trust you." A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine. She knew Victoria was suspicious, and that put her in immediate danger. "Thank you for telling me, Mason," she said, trying to sound composed. "I'll be careful." That evening, Elizabeth and Emma attempted to send the evidence to the local authorities via email, but they encountered an unexpected problem. The cruise ship's internet connection was blocked. Every attempt to upload the file failed, and the screen displayed an error message. "This isn't normal," Emma said, frustrated. "Someone is controlling the network. They know we're trying to contact someone." Elizabeth bit her lip, feeling desperation rise within her. "Then we need another way. Maybe we can hand it over in person when the ship docks at the next port." "That's in 3 days," Emma said, shaking her head. "I'm not sure we can wait that long. Victoria is already suspicious of you, and James won't stay idle." Before they could decide on their next move, someone banged on the cabin door with force. "Emma, open the door," a male voice demanded. Emma and Elizabeth exchanged panicked looks. "It's Marco, one of James' assistants," Emma whispered. "What do we do?" Elizabeth asked, her heart pounding. "Hide the recording device and get behind the curtain," Emma said quickly. "I'll handle him." Elizabeth did as instructed, hiding as Emma opened the door. Marco, a burly man with an intimidating presence, stepped inside. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion as he looked around the cabin. "I'm checking my work schedule," Emma replied, trying to sound casual. Marco scanned the room, his eyes searching for something. "Victoria asked me to check on things. Seems like someone here is sticking their nose where it doesn't belong." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Emma said, crossing her arms. "I'm just another employee." Marco didn't look convinced but eventually left, issuing a final warning before he did. "Stay in your lane, Emma. You don't want to get into trouble." Once he was gone, Elizabeth emerged from her hiding spot, trembling from the tension. "This is getting worse. We need to get off this ship before it's too late." Emma nodded. "Tomorrow we'll try to deliver the evidence directly to someone we can trust at the port. We can't wait for them to make the first move." The next morning, Elizabeth found an anonymous envelope slipped under her cabin door. When she opened it, she froze in terror. Inside was a photograph of her children, Thomas and Sophia, playing at the park near their home. On the back, a handwritten message read, "We know where they are. If you keep going, they will pay the price." Elizabeth felt fear wash over her, but it quickly turned into an intense anger that fueled her resolve. She wouldn't allow James or his associates to threaten her children. She was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. The sunrise reflected off the ocean, but for Elizabeth, the tranquility of the view could not reach her troubled mind. The photo of her children remained in her pocket, its weight and the attached threat haunting her every step. She knew the time had come to act before it was too late. Emma was waiting for her at the back deck, where they had agreed to meet and finalize their next move. "I found a way to leave the ship before we reach the port," Emma said quietly, her face tense with worry. "There's an emergency lifeboat. If we can get to it without being seen, we can escape and deliver the evidence." Elizabeth nodded, though her heart raced. "It's risky, but we don't have another choice. I can't stay here knowing they're threatening my children. I won't give them the time to follow through on those threats." Emma gently touched her arm. "I know, Elizabeth. Your kids need you, and we'll make sure this works. But we have to move quickly. Victoria and Marco are likely already aware of what we're planning." The two women began making their way toward the area where the lifeboat was located, trying to blend in among the passengers and crew who were starting their daily routines. But the feeling of being watched was unavoidable. Every lingering glance, every hushed conversation around them seemed to signal that their enemies were closing in. As they walked, Elizabeth couldn't help but think back to the happy moments she had once shared with James before everything fell apart. The sound of her children's laughter echoed in her mind, a reminder of the love she had once believed was unbreakable. But those memories now fueled her anger. How could James do this to me? She thought, clenching her fists. How could he abandon his family and betray everything we were? Emma, noticing Elizabeth's silence, glanced at her with concern. I know it's hard to focus with so much on your mind, but you need to stay alert. They won't stop until they've caught us. Elizabeth took a deep breath and nodded. You're right. I can't afford to be distracted now. This isn't just for me. It's for my kids and the life they deserve. When they reached the loading area where the lifeboat was stored, they found the entrance blocked by a heavy chain. Emma pulled a tool from her bag and began working to break it while Elizabeth kept watch. This should only take a minute, Emma said, concentrating on the task. But before they could proceed, Elizabeth heard hurried footsteps behind them. She turned quickly and saw Marco, accompanied by 2 ship security guards, striding directly toward them. Stop right there, Marco commanded, his voice echoing with authority. Panic surged through Elizabeth, but she refused to let it paralyze her. Emma, hurry, she whispered urgently, positioning herself between Marco and the lifeboat to buy time. Marco smirked arrogantly as he approached. Did you really think you could escape so easily? You should have stayed in your place, Elizabeth. This has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me, Elizabeth shot back, her voice rising. I won't let you or James continue to destroy lives. You need to pay for what you've done. Marco laughed, though his eyes betrayed a glint of menace. James is smarter than you think. He's always 2 steps ahead. You should worry about yourself and your children. That comment ignited a spark of fury in Elizabeth. She stepped closer, standing her ground. Don't you dare mention my kids. You have no idea what I'm capable of when it comes to protecting them. At that moment, Emma managed to break the chain and called out, It's open. Let's go. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the lifeboat as Marco shouted orders to the guards. The men tried to intercept them, but Emma started the engine just in time. Elizabeth leapt aboard as the guards reached the dock, powerless to stop them. The lifeboat sped away from the cruise ship, and Elizabeth felt a wave of relief mixed with adrenaline as the waves carried them farther and farther from danger. But she knew this wasn't the end. James and his network wouldn't let them go without a fight. Hours later, Elizabeth and Emma arrived at a small island with a local police station. Exhausted but resolute, they handed over the evidence to a senior officer, explaining everything that had transpired on the ship. The officer reviewed the documents and the recording, his expression growing graver as he grasped the severity of the case. This is enough to launch a formal investigation, he said at last. But you need to understand, these people are dangerous. I strongly recommend you stay under protection while we proceed. Elizabeth nodded, knowing there was still a long road ahead. But for the first time in years, she felt the scales of justice tipping in her favor. Elizabeth watched the horizon from the train window as it carried her home. The city's lights slowly faded, replaced by green hills and small houses illuminated by streetlights. In her hands, she held a brown envelope containing the legal documents confirming James's imprisonment and the dissolution of his fraudulent network. It was tangible closure, yet the emotions swirling in her chest were anything but settled. The sound of her children's laughter echoed in her mind. Thomas and Sophia were waiting for her at home with Emma, who, despite her own struggles, had become a pillar of support for their family. This return marked the end of a nightmare and the beginning of something new. As the train moved forward, Elizabeth allowed herself to reflect on everything that had happened. Publicly confronting James had been liberating yet deeply painful. She remembered how she had unmasked him before the cruise ship's passengers, presenting the evidence she had worked so hard to collect. James had tried to salvage his reputation with lies and manipulation, but the proof was irrefutable. The scene was still fresh in her memory. This man is not only a fraud, Elizabeth had declared in the center of the grand hall, her voice trembling but steady. He is also my husband, presumed dead 7 years ago. He faked his accident and left me alone to shoulder debt and grief while he lived a life of luxury. The murmurs in the crowd grew into a clamor. James had attempted to calm the audience, denying her accusations, But Elizabeth had produced the definitive document, a contract signed by him and his accomplices, directly linking their crimes to the stolen funds of countless families. "Do you have anything to say now?" Elizabeth had challenged, looking him directly in the eyes. James, defeated, had no response. That was when the ship's authorities entered the hall, escorting him out as the passengers looked on with disdain. For Elizabeth, that moment was not just a legal victory. It was a declaration that she would no longer be a victim. Back on the train, Elizabeth clutched the documents tightly. Although justice had prevailed, she knew the real work was just beginning. She had promised her children a better life, and that required not only strength but also the will to heal the wounds James had left behind. When she arrived at the station, Thomas and Sophia ran toward her, hugging her so tightly she almost fell. Elizabeth held them close, tears in her eyes. "We're together again," she whispered, kissing their foreheads. The following months were filled with small but meaningful steps toward rebuilding. Elizabeth used part of the recovered money from James's accounts to open a small cafe in town. Emma, who had proven to be a loyal friend and resourceful partner, became her business partner. Together, they transformed an old building into a cozy space filled with books, soft music, and the constant aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The cafe became more than a business. It was a refuge for Elizabeth. The townspeople, curious at first, soon became regulars, drawn by the warmth of the place and the kindness of Elizabeth and Emma. The twins, Thomas and Sophia, helped out during their free time, learning the value of teamwork and finally feeling a sense of stability and home. One afternoon, as Elizabeth was cleaning tables at the end of the day, an unexpected visitor entered the cafe. It was the detective who had handled James's case. He carried a folder with new documents Elizabeth hadn't requested. "I thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing her the folder. "We found a letter James wrote while in custody. It's addressed to you and the children. I thought you might want to have it." Elizabeth stared at the folder cautiously, unsure if she wanted to open it. "Thank you," she said finally, placing the papers on the counter. The detective paused for a moment before adding, "I know I can't change what happened, but you have a strength most people don't. What you've done for your family and the victims of James is admirable. I hope you find peace." That night, after closing the cafe, Elizabeth sat alone in her living room. James's letter lay in front of her next to a cup of tea. For a moment, she considered burning it, erasing every trace of him from her life. But something inside her urged her to open it. James's words were a mix of regret and justification. He admitted to making irreparable mistakes, but claimed he had acted out of a desire to protect them. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he wrote. "I just want you to know that I always loved you, even if my actions didn't show it. I hope you find the happiness I couldn't give you." Elizabeth placed the letter on the table and sighed deeply. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but she also realized she didn't need to hold on to the anger. For the first time, she understood that forgiveness wasn't for James. It was for her own liberation. A year later, the cafe was thriving. Thomas and Sophia played in the backyard while Emma and Elizabeth reviewed the finances. The small business had become a gathering place for the community, filled with laughter, stories, and hope. "You've accomplished so much, Elizabeth," Emma said with a warm smile. "Do you remember how it all started? It feels like a distant dream now." Elizabeth nodded, watching her children play under the golden light of the sunset. "Sometimes it feels like the past was a nightmare, but what we have now, this, is real. And that's all that matters." As night fell, Elizabeth stood for a moment at the cafe door, looking up at the starry sky. Though the scars of her past remained, they no longer defined her. She was a strong woman, a devoted mother, and, above all, someone who had learned to find light even in the darkest of times. Final lesson of the story: life isn't always fair, but the strength to overcome lies within each person's heart and determination. Elizabeth's journey showed that even when all seems lost, it's possible to rebuild, heal, and find purpose. Her story is a testament to resilience and an inspiration for those facing their own storms. In the end, hope can bloom in the most unexpected places. Thank you for listening to this incredible story until the end. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We also suggest watching the video that appears on the screen so you can discover other amazing stories, because I guarantee you'll be surprised.